The sea was calm that morning, unnervingly calm. The kind of calm that made sailors whisper prayers under their breath, as if the ocean were holding its breath too. From the deck of the relief ship, the captain stared at the rising cliffs of Eilean Moor, the largest of the Flannan Isles. A cluster of bare rocks in the endless gray of the North Atlantic. No trees, no harbor, only wind, waves, and the white tower of a lighthouse built to keep men from being swallowed by the sea. They were late, a week late. The December storms had been merciless, keeping them from delivering the new keeper and fresh supplies. But when the weather finally cleared, something about the stillness felt wrong. The lighthouse stood there solitary and watching, yet no flag waved from its pole. No smoke rose from the chimney, and when the ship sounded its horn, there was no answer. The men looked at one another. The relief keeper muttered that maybe the others were still asleep. But even as he said it, his voice broke slightly. He knew better. Keepers never slept past dawn. Not when duty called. The small landing boat struggled through the surf, scraping against the jagged rocks. The landing platform was empty. The wooden box that usually waited there for mail and messages was gone. And when they climbed the iron ladder to the narrow path leading up the cliffside, the gate was unlatched, swinging gently in the wind. At the top, the grass was slick with rain. The air smelled of salt and iron. When they reached the lighthouse door, the captain knocked. No reply. He tried the handle, turned easily. Inside, the air was stale and damp. The clock on the wall had stopped. On the kitchen table lay a half-eaten meal, the plates still neatly set, bread, cold meat, and pickles. A chair was toppled over as if someone had stood in haste. The beds were made, the oil lamps full, everything in its place, except for the men. The captain called their names into the spiral of the stairwell, his voice echoing upward into silence. Only the low moan of the wind answered. When they reached the lantern room at the top, the light was out, the mechanism intact. But one of the storm shutters had been torn from its hinges. Outside, the sea glistened, deceptively peaceful. A sheet of pewter beneath a sky the color of stone. And that was when they noticed the logbook. The last entry was dated December 15th. It mentioned a storm, a violent one, wind howling like a beast, waves higher than the tower itself. One of the men, it said, had been very quiet, another crying. But what struck the captain most was the tone of the final line. It read simply, "Storm ended. Sea calm. God is over all." No further entries followed. He stared at those words for a long time. Something about them felt less like reassurance and more like surrender. Outside, one of the sailors shouted. He had found the west landing platform, the one used during calmer weather. The iron railings were twisted. A storage box was shattered. Ropes lay strewn across the rocks like seaweed. But there were no bodies, no footprints, only the endless sound of water. That evening, as the captain raised the flag half-mast and recorded his report, the sun vanished into a red horizon, and the lighthouse stood silent. A monument to 3 men who had simply ceased to exist. From that moment, the story of the Flannan Isles became something else. Not just a report in a logbook, but a question that would haunt sailors and islanders alike for generations. How do 3 men vanish from a rock in the middle of the sea, leaving everything behind but the echo of their work? And why did the last words they wrote sound less like faith and more like farewell? The investigation began quietly, almost bureaucratically. A board of inquiry convened on the mainland, composed of inspectors, mariners, and a representative of the lighthouse service. They examined the reports, interviewed the relief crew, and combed through every line of the station's records. But the more they learned, the less they understood. The first missing keeper had been the principal, a stoic man in his 40s, known for discipline and devotion. He had served on lighthouses for decades without incident. The second was younger, reserved, thoughtful, a man who often wrote poetry about the sea. The third was the youngest, barely past his 20s, newly married, eager to prove himself. All 3 had been experienced, trustworthy, and steady. And yet, the logbook suggested fear. Not physical panic, something deeper. Emotional strain. Witnesses recalled how one of them had seemed troubled before his last posting. He had lost a friend at sea the previous year, crushed between waves and rocks. Another had written to his family that the isolation was beginning to speak to him, that the silence of the islands was a thing alive. The investigators studied the weather charts. On December 15th, a storm had indeed swept the region. Waves recorded up to 30 meters high, but that was not unusual for winter in the North Atlantic. And the lighthouse had been built precisely to withstand such fury. Still, the evidence pointed toward the west landing. The broken railing, the missing ropes, the displaced stone. Perhaps one of the men had gone down to secure equipment during the storm, the others following to help. A sudden wave, a monstrous surge, might have swept them away together. It was plausible. It was neat, but it did not explain everything. Why had 2 sets of oilskins, heavy weather coats, been taken, while the third remained hanging in place? Why was the door locked from the inside? And why did that final log entry sound almost ritualistic, as though written in resignation, not routine? For weeks, newspapers seized upon the mystery. Some said the men had fled, deserters, though to where? Others claimed madness, that one had turned on the others, driven insane by isolation. There were whispers, too, darker ones, of sea spirits, of old island myths, of the phantom of the Flannans, said to call sailors into the deep. But beyond the folklore, the truth seemed simpler and sadder. When the investigators interviewed the families, they found traces of longing and quiet dread. One wife recalled her husband's last letter. He had written of dreams, recurring ones, of standing on the edge of the cliffs, watching the sea rise like a wall, and feeling both terrified and strangely at peace. Another letter spoke of the bell that hung outside the tower. During storms, it would toll endlessly, carried by the wind. The sound, he said, feels like a prayer no one answers. That detail stayed with the inspector. The bell. On their return to the island, he ordered a small team to inspect it. They found the iron clapper rusted, the chain tangled, but it still moved, gently when the wind shifted. And in that hollow sound, echoing through the empty station, he imagined what it must have been like to stand there in the dark, 3 men alone, listening to the endless toll of the sea. Perhaps he thought it wasn't madness. Perhaps it was simply too much silence. When his report was filed, it concluded with cautious professionalism. The most probable explanation is that the men were carried away by a wave while securing the west landing during severe weather. But the tone of his handwriting in the margins told another story. A personal note, never meant for the record. There are storms of the mind that leave no survivors. Years passed, and the lighthouse continued its duty. New keepers came, quietly replacing the lost. The light was relit. The logs resumed. The world moved on. But the story never left the shore. Fishermen claimed they saw shadows on the cliffs. Visitors swore they heard voices carried by the wind. And once, when a supply ship anchored nearby, a crewman said he saw a figure at the lantern window, motionless, staring out to sea. When they went up, the tower was empty. It was easy to dismiss. The sea has a way of playing tricks on the mind. But the feeling lingered. Something about that place refused to settle. A decade later, the inspector, now retired, made one last journey to the Flannan Isles. He was an old man by then, walking with a cane, the sea wind clawing at his coat. He wanted, he said, to see the place for himself once more, to understand what had really happened. He stayed in the tower for a night, alone. The lamp still worked, newer now, electrified. But the rest was the same. The narrow bunks, the wooden table, the endless hum of the wind through the stone walls. He sat by the window, reading the copied logbook entries again. Storm ended. Sea calm. God is over all. Outside, the waves broke softly against the rocks. And for the first time, he realized the line wasn't resignation, it was acceptance. The words of men who had looked into the heart of something vast and unanswerable, and found peace there. He closed his eyes and imagined them on that final day. The storm raging, the tower shaking, one man going down to check the landing ropes, another following to help, a third waiting by the door, perhaps calling out, and then a wall of water rising, roaring, swallowing the world in white. No time to shout. No time to pray. Only silence. The next morning, he placed a small wooden carving, a ship in miniature, on the windowsill before leaving. It had belonged to one of the men's children, given to him years earlier when the inquiry ended. He looked back once more at the lighthouse before stepping into the boat. It stood unmoving against the horizon, light gleaming faintly through mist, a symbol of endurance and of fragility. Some mysteries, he thought, were not meant to be solved. They were meant to be remembered. As the boat pulled away, the sea was calm again, as it had been that first morning all those years ago. The bell on the tower stirred faintly in the wind, and for a moment, in the faint ring of iron against air, it almost sounded like a farewell. A farewell not just to the three who vanished, but to every soul who ever stood guard against the dark and faced what the world could not explain. Because in the end, the Flannan Isles were not a story of disappearance, but of devotion. 3 men who kept their light burning until the sea took them. 3 names carried away by wind and tide. And one truth left behind, written in the silence they left upon the rocks, that some lights never truly go out.